The void of space was silent. But silence in war was never peace. It was the breath before the kill. High above the fractured remains of Zareth's moon, the Dominion warship Vindicator loomed like an obsidian leviathan against the cold abyss. Its midnight-colored hull reflected the distant glow of Andromeda's twin suns. Its surface, a network of interlocking armor plates reinforced with adaptive shielding. Beneath its hull, weapons of unimaginable power rested in eerie stillness. Colossal railguns, plasma disruptors, and the terrifying Eclipse-class annihilation cannon, a weapon so powerful it could split a planet's crust with a single concentrated pulse. On the command bridge, Admiral Kale Varos stood rigid, his piercing gaze locked onto the holographic war table. Lines of shifting light mapped out the battlefield, flickering red markers signaling the incoming resistance fleet, a ragtag force daring to challenge the Dominion's rule. A sharp voice broke through the heavy silence. "Admiral, enemy fleet!" Emerging from subspace, 79 ships in total, Scorch-class frigates, Rift Dancers, and the tactical officer hesitated. "They've brought a Colossus-class dreadnought." Varos's jaw tightened. A Colossus. The Resistance had spent years salvaging, upgrading, and reverse engineering one of the oldest behemoths ever built. An ancient war machine from a long-forgotten era, outfitted with experimental shielding and an energy core capable of sustaining entire fleets. It was a declaration. The Resistance had come for war. He turned slowly to his officers. "Deploy Stormfang squadrons, arm the Eclipse-class disruptor, and bring forward railguns to full charge." The order set everything into motion. Across the Vindicator, the Dominion war machine roared to life. Fighters poured from the hangar bays in coordinated swarms, their sleek black hulls vanishing into the star-drenched void. Warships maneuvered into attack formations, their shields flaring, as kinetic barriers strengthened. Energy readings spiked as weapons primed, charging for the inevitable onslaught. Varos inhaled deeply, his fingers flexing behind his back. He had fought 100 battles, crushed entire planetary uprisings, reduced moons to dust, and broken fleets twice the size of his own. The Resistance believed in hope. He believed in certainty, and tonight he would remind them why the Dominion always won. Across the battlefield, the celestial fury drifted like a predator waiting to strike. Aged but battle-hardened, its scarred hull bore the marks of countless skirmishes. Inside, Captain Liora Tane's violet-hued eyes remained locked on the enemy's formation, studying every detail, every weakness. The Dominion's fleet outnumbered them, outgunned them, but she had seen warriors fall to arrogance before. "Patch me through to all ships," she ordered. Her communications officer nodded, and the fleet-wide channel crackled to life. Across the Resistance vessels, captains, pilots, and gunners leaned in, listening. "This is Captain Tane," she began, her voice unwavering. "We have fought too hard, lost too much to kneel now. The Dominion believes it owns the stars, that it can strip our worlds of their freedom without consequence. But they underestimate us. They forget that freedom is a force greater than any fleet, any weapon. They forget that warriors are not forged in peace, they are born in fire. Today, we remind them, we make them bleed. Stand your ground, fight for the Andromeda Sector." A thunderous chorus of acknowledgements followed. "All wings, prepare for combat." The Resistance fleet moved as one. Fighters launched in coordinated squadrons, their engines streaking blue trails through the black. Warships adjusted their trajectories, angling for strategic positioning. The Colossus dreadnought, the Iron Requiem, powered its main core, sending shockwaves of energy rippling through space. Then, the first barrage was unleashed. Streaks of plasma torpedoes ignited the darkness, cutting through the abyss like shooting stars. Cannons roared to life, unleashing blinding volleys of destruction. Energy shields flared as impacts rattled hulls. The Resistance fighters dove through the chaos, weaving between blasts, targeting the Dominion's lead destroyers. On the bridge of the Vindicator, Varos watched the battlefield unfold with calculating precision. He was not impressed. "Execute." "Omega formation," he commanded. The Dominion's fleet responded instantly. Destroyers shifted into a wedge formation, reinforcing their flanks. Heavy cruisers spread their firepower, creating a near-impenetrable wall of suppression fire. In the Heart of it all, the Vindicator remained still, biding its time. Then it struck. A pulse of unnatural darkness rippled through space. The Vindicator's Eclipse-class cannon discharged, and in an instant, a resistance cruiser was reduced to molten debris. The explosion sent shockwaves outward, tearing through smaller fighters, caught in its radius. Liora gritted her teeth as the blast rattled the celestial fury. "Status on the Colossus?" she demanded. "Core still charging," her engineer shouted. 17% and rising. We need more time." Time was something they didn't have. Varos saw the hesitation in their formation, the brief moment of doubt. He seized it. "Target the celestial fury. I want her crippled, not destroyed. Their captain will watch her fleet burn before she falls." Liora braced as Dominion railgun rounds thundered toward them. She had fought too long, bled too much to let this end here. With a sharp breath, she turned to her helmsman. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We are taking the fight straight to them." The stars themselves trembled as the battle reached its boiling point. Every great journey starts with a few brave explorers. Right now, Galactic War Stories is just beginning, and your support means everything. If you love epic sci-fi battles, deep space mysteries, and the untold stories of the cosmos, hit subscribe. It's free and it helps us grow this universe together. The war drums of battle thundered across the void. Laser fire carved glowing scars into the abyss, tracer rounds slicing between dueling warships. The Resistance fleet swarmed through the chaos, dodging the relentless Dominion onslaught. Fighters weaved between debris, their pulse cannons lighting up the darkness. The Dominion's wedge formation held firm, its destroyers forming an unbreakable wall of defense. But this was not a battle won by brute force alone. Strategy, precision, and sheer defiance would decide who ruled the Andromeda Sector. Captain Liora gripped the railing of the Celestial Fury, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythmic vibrations of battle. Explosions rippled across the viewport, starships torn apart by Dominion artillery. "Report," she called out. Her tactical officer, Kalen Drake, wiped blood from his temple, his voice strained over the howling alarms. "The Iron Requiem's core is still charging. We're at 43%, still not enough for a full planetary strike. And the fleet?" Kalen's expression darkened. "We've lost 4 cruisers, 3 frigates, and 2 full squadrons of fighters. The Dominion's formation is holding, they're not breaking." Liora's mind raced. They needed an opening, a fracture in the Dominion's iron grip. The Resistance could not win a war of attrition against a force as overwhelming as the Dominion's. But there was always a way. Always. A new voice cut through the chaos, a communication from the Iron Requiem. The grizzled face of Commander Joran Malix flickered onto the holo display, scars running down his weathered face like battle records. His voice was rough, determined. "Captain, we're picking up a power spike from the Vindicator." Liora stiffened. "The Eclipse cannon?" Malix nodded. "It's cycling again. If it fires another shot, we'll lose more than just a few ships. We could lose the battle." She had no time to hesitate. "Bring me Lieutenant Vayner," she ordered. Seconds later, a young pilot in a battered flight suit appeared on the holocom. Her features were sharp, her eyes burning with a reckless determination. She had led countless high-risk missions. If anyone could do the impossible, it was Vayner. "Vayner," Liora said, "I need you to take your squadron and disable the Vindicators. Eclipse cannon before it fires again. This is a precision strike, fast and clean." Vayner smirked. "You always give me the fun jobs, Captain." The comm cut out as Vayner and her squadron launched from the Celestial Fury. They accelerated toward the Dominion flagship like spectral wraiths, vanishing into the smoke of battle. On the Vindicator's bridge, Admiral Kael Varos stood like an unshakable statue amidst the storm. The Dominion fleet was pushing forward. The Resistance was faltering. It was only a matter of time before their rebellion collapsed entirely. "Status on the Eclipse cannon?" he asked. A weapons officer turned, his expression neutral. 82% charged. We are ready to fire in 2 minutes." Varos allowed himself a rare smirk. One more strike, and the Resistance fleet would break. One more calculated blow, and their fractured alliance would crumble under the weight of despair. But then something shifted. New blips appeared on the tactical display, fast, small signatures cutting through the Dominion's defenses. Fighters, Resistance fighters. Varos's smirk disappeared. Where are they going? The answer was obvious before anyone could speak. The Eclipse cannon. Interceptors on them now, Varos barked. But Vena's squadron was already too close. The Dominion's defenses scrambled to react, but the fighters slipped past, weaving between the Vindicator's turrets with impossible precision. Pulse rounds screamed through the corridors of space. Automated cannons tracked and fired, but Vena was faster. She dove low, skimming the hull of the warship, her squadron following in perfect formation. Then she saw it. The power relay. The Vindicator's Eclipse cannon was its deadliest weapon, but also its most fragile. Its energy conduit ran along the starboard side, exposed beneath layers of shielding. A vulnerability, a flaw, a perfect target. Vena gritted her teeth. Squadron, lock onto the relay, fire on my mark. A chorus of acknowledgements echoed back. She pulled the trigger. The first missile struck true, piercing the shielding with a burst of white-hot energy. The second followed a heartbeat later, then a third, a fourth, until finally the energy conduit erupted in a catastrophic explosion. The Vindicator lurched, its power grid flickering as emergency fail-safes tried to compensate. The Eclipse cannon, once on the verge of firing, went dark. On the bridge, Varos watched in stunned silence as warning sirens blared. The pulse of destruction he had counted on had been extinguished in an instant. For the first time in a long while, his fingers clenched in frustration. "Contain the damage," he ordered, his voice tight. "And find out who did this." Liora watched, the explosion from her bridge a slow smile forming. They had bought themselves time, but the battle was far from over. "Captain," Kalen spoke, urgency in his tone. "The Iron Requiem's core is at 65%, but we're still not there. Yet," Liora turned back to the viewport. The Dominion fleet was regrouping, shifting to new tactics. Varos would not let this go unanswered, and in the silence before the next wave of chaos, Liora Tain prepared for the next move in the battle that would decide the fate of the Andromeda Sector. The void trembled with the aftershock of the explosion. The Vindicator's Eclipse cannon, once the Dominion's most devastating weapon, lay crippled, its energy relays in ruins, its firepower silenced. But victory was fleeting. The Dominion was wounded, not defeated, and a wounded beast is the most dangerous of all. Liora Tain gripped the Celestial Fury's command rail, scanning the battlefield. Smoke and debris drifted like spectral wraiths. In the vacuum of space, remnants of shattered starships and fallen warriors. The Resistance fleet had bought itself a moment of survival, but it would not last. "Incoming transmission," Kalen called out, his voice sharp with urgency. The holo display flickered to life and a grim face filled the screen. Commander Joran Malix of the Iron Requiem. "Captain," he said, his voice taut, "we've hit 75% charge. We'll be battle ready for a full strike soon, but we've got a problem." Liora narrowed her eyes. "What kind of problem?" Malix's image wavered as interference crackled through the transmission. Then his words cut through like a blade. "The Dominion is bringing in reinforcements." Silence gripped the bridge. Liora turned to her tactical officer. "Confirm." Kalen's fingers danced across the holo interface. The main display shifted, zooming into the outer perimeter of the battlefield. And there, emerging from the depths of hyperspace, were 3 massive Dominion warships, Leviathan-class battlecruisers. Their hulls were obsidian black, lined with streaks of pulsing crimson energy. A fleet of smaller escort destroyers flanked them, forming an impenetrable wall of death. Kalen exhaled. They just turned the tide. Liora's jaw clenched. She had seen these ships before, harbingers of annihilation. The Dominion had not just sent reinforcements, they had sent executioners. "Orders, Captain?" Liora's mind raced. The Resistance fleet was already battered, their numbers depleted. If the Dominion's reinforcements entered the battle, they would be crushed. The Iron Requiem's superweapon was still charging. They needed time, just a little more time. She turned back to the holo display. "Malix, what's your current defensive status?" Malix's face was grim. "We've reinforced the Iron Requiem's shielding, but it won't hold forever. If those Leviathans break through, they'll rip us apart before we can fire." Liora's eyes flickered toward the tactical map, then back to her crew. They had to delay the Dominion's advance, by any means necessary. She exhaled sharply. I have an idea. Deep in the bowels of the Dominion flagship, Admiral Kale Varos strode through the command deck of the Vindicator, his presence like a cold wind cutting through steel. The Eclipse cannon had failed. His fleet was still locked in battle, and now the Resistance thought they had a chance. Varos's crimson gaze settled on the tactical display. The Resistance fleet was regrouping, forming a defensive line around the Iron Requiem. They were stalling. He knew exactly why. "Sir," one of his officers reported, "our reinforcements have arrived. The Onyx Fangs are preparing for a full forward assault." Varos nodded. "Deploy them. I want that ship destroyed before its core reaches full charge." The officer hesitated. "Captain, the Resistance is making an unusual move." Varos narrowed his eyes. "Explain." "They're advancing, sir." Varos's gaze snapped to the holo display. And there it was. Against all logic, against all survival instincts, the Resistance fleet was pushing forward. Liora Taney's forces, instead of retreating, were closing the distance, flying straight at the Dominion's reinforcements in a desperate charge. A smirk touched the Admiral's lips. "So, she intends to break us before we break her." Liora's voice was steady as she spoke across the comms to every remaining ship in the fleet. "We stand at the edge of annihilation," she said. "The Dominion believes we are weak, that we will scatter in the face of their might. But they are wrong. They do not understand that we fight not for power, not for conquest, but for freedom. For every world that has suffered under their rule, for every voice they have silenced. And today they will know that even in the darkness we do not bow, we do not break, we rise." Across the Resistance fleet, pilots braced for battle, crews gritted their teeth, their hands steady on the controls. The Celestial Fury led the charge, engines roaring like thunder. The Dominion's reinforcements moved to intercept, their turrets igniting the void with streaks of crimson fire. The battle reignited in full force. Liora's ship twisted through the chaos, pulse cannons unloading. With relentless fury, Dominion interceptors swarmed in response, their sleek fighters slicing through the fray. Explosions flared like dying stars, shockwaves rippling through the battlefield. On the Vindicator, Admiral Varos leaned forward. "She's reckless," he murmured, "and recklessness leads to ruin." He turned to his officers. "Engage the Celestial Fury, take her down." As the battle raged, deep within the Iron Requiem's command center, Joran Malix watched the countdown. The superweapons core had reached 90% charge. Almost there. "Come on," Malix whispered. "Just a little longer." But fate was cruel. A warning siren blared through the ship, multiple Dominion ships breaking through the line. Malix's stomach dropped. The Iron Requiem was vulnerable. If even one of those ships landed a direct hit on the core, a comm alert flashed. "This is Liora." Her voice crackled through the speakers. "We're holding them off, but we can't stop all of them. If one of those destroyers breaches your hull—" Malix cut her off. "I know." He turned to his crew. "Redirect all defensive turrets to the starboard flank. We need to—" A blast rocked the ship. The bridge lurched. Consoles exploded in showers of sparks. Malix hit the deck hard, the taste of blood on his tongue. He looked up. His heart turned to ice. A Dominion destroyer had broken through. It was bearing down on them, and it was targeting the Iron Requiem's core. Liora saw it, and in that moment she knew what had to be done. No hesitation. No fear. She gripped the controls of the Celestial Fury and veered sharply toward the enemy destroyer. "Captain, what are you doing?" Kalen shouted. Liora's voice was calm. "Stopping them." The Celestial Fury burned forward at full throttle, its engines roaring like a vengeful god. It wasn't just a ship anymore, it was a missile, straight toward the Dominion's destroyer. The stars blurred as the Celestial Fury hurtled toward the Dominion destroyer. The ship's engines burned at full throttle, its hull shaking from the sheer velocity. Liora's hands gripped the controls, her pulse steady, her mind focused. This was it. If the Dominion destroyer reached the Iron Requiem's core, the battle would be over. The Resistance's final hope would be erased in a single catastrophic blast. There was no margin for failure. "Liora," Kalen's voice rang through the comms. "Pull back, you won't survive this." She ignored him. The targeting scanners locked onto the destroyer's engines. A direct impact at this speed would be devastating, but it wasn't enough. If the destroyer's reactor remained intact, it could still complete its mission. She needed another way. Her mind raced. Then it hit her. One final maneuver. Liora flipped open the ship's manual override, disengaging the autopilot. The celestial fury veered sharply, its trajectory shifting just enough to avoid a direct impact. Instead of a head-on collision, the ship would pass mere meters from the Dominion destroyer's hull, and as it did, she would eject. Her fingers flew across the controls, locking in the course correction. The ship's torpedo bays primed for detonation, a calculated explosion, one that would rip through the destroyer's weak points and ensure its destruction. The plan was suicide, but it was also the only chance they had. With one final breath, she activated the escape sequence. The cockpit's emergency release hissed, and the reinforced ejection pod blasted free just as the celestial fury slammed past the Dominion destroyer. The ship's torpedoes detonated in a chain reaction, igniting the enemy vessel's fuel reserves. A blinding shockwave tore through the void. On the bridge of the Iron Requiem, Joran Malix shielded his eyes as the explosion consumed the Dominion destroyer. The massive warship buckled, its armor splitting apart before it erupted in a final, violent burst of fire and debris. The crew erupted in cheers. Malix, however, was scanning the wreckage. His eyes darted over the holodisplay, searching. There. Small emergency pod tumbled through the chaos, caught in the gravitational pull of a collapsing Dominion wreck. "Liora," he whispered. Inside the pod, Liora struggled to regain control. The explosion had sent her careening off course, the tiny vessel spinning wildly. Her vision blurred as she fought against the G-forces, her hands gripping the manual. Stabilizers. A warning flashed, oxygen reserves critically low. The pod's structural integrity was failing. She needed to find a way back. Through the viewport, she could see the battlefield still raging. The Iron Requiem was holding position, its superweapon at 95% charge. Dominion warships were still pressing the attack, desperate to stop the Resistance's final weapon from firing. But Liora's gaze was drawn to something else, a shadow in the distance. Something massive was emerging from hyperspace. Her heart pounded. No. The Dominion wasn't finished, not yet. Aboard the Vindicator, Admiral Kale Varos stood motionless, watching the battlefield unfold. His expression was unreadable, but his crimson eyes burned with silent fury. Liora Tane's reckless gambit had cost him one of his destroyers, an unacceptable loss, but it would not change the outcome. "Sir," an officer reported, his voice tinged with apprehension, "our reinforcements have arrived." Varos's gaze shifted to the viewport. Beyond the chaos of battle, a new presence loomed in the darkness. The harbinger of ruin, a Dominion dreadnought. Nearly 5 times the size of the Vindicator, its hull was lined with pulsating energy conduits, each one feeding into its most terrifying weapon, an antimatter annihilation array, capable of reducing entire fleets to drifting ash. The Resistance had fought well, but the Dominion had just escalated the war. Varos allowed himself the faintest smirk. "Prepare the annihilation array," he ordered. "End this." Inside her escape pod, Liora could do nothing but watch as the harbinger of ruin came into view. It dwarfed everything in its path, a titan of war, its weapons pulsing with energy. No Resistance ship could withstand a direct hit from that monstrosity. Even the Iron Requiem wouldn't survive. Her mind raced. There had to be a way, there had to be. The pod's communications flickered to life. A crackling voice came through the static. "Liora! Do you read me?" It was Malix. She exhaled in relief. "I'm here. Barely. We're locking onto your position. We'll get you out of there, but we have a bigger problem." "I see it." Her voice was grim. "The dreadnought." "Yeah," Malix said, "and our superweapon is still charging. We need another minute, but I don't think they'll give us that long." Liora's mind snapped into focus. "Then we need to delay them." Malix's hesitation was barely noticeable. How? Liora glanced at the rapidly approaching dreadnought. It was deploying its first wave of attack drones, hundreds of them swarming. Ahead like a mechanical storm. A plan formed in her mind. It was insane, but insanity was all they had left. "Get me aboard the Iron Requiem," she said. "I have an idea." Across the battlefield, the Resistance fleet was buckling under the weight of the Dominion's counterattack. Ships burned, hulls ruptured, and the void was filled with streaks of weapons fire. On the bridge of the Iron Requiem, Malix and his crew fought to hold their ground, diverting all remaining power into the shields. But it wasn't enough. The Harbinger of Ruin was closing in, its annihilation array nearing full charge. And then, a streak of light. A small vessel cut through the chaos, moving at impossible speed. Liora. She had made it aboard, and she was heading straight for the Iron Requiem's core. Malix's eyes widened. What the hell is she doing? Kalen, still recovering from the chaos, checked the ship's internal scanners. She's going for the main reactor controls. Realization struck Malix like a hammer. She's going to overload the weapon. Liora's voice came over the comms. "This thing wasn't built for just one shot, Malix. We've been limiting it because of energy constraints, but if we bypass the fail-safes, we can unleash everything we have." Malix gritted his teeth. "Liora, that kind of overload could destroy the Harbinger of Ruin before it fires." Silence. Then Malix exhaled. "Do it." The countdown hit 99%. Liora's fingers danced across the controls, overriding the weapon's safety measures. Warning sirens blared as the ship's systems fought against her commands, but she pressed on. The Iron Requiem began to glow. A rising hum filled the air as the ship's superweapon surged with unstable power. The energy cores pulsed wildly, their containment fields barely holding. Liora gripped the final release switch. Fire. A blinding beam of energy erupted from the Iron Requiem, an unfiltered, catastrophic pulse of destruction. It struck the Harbinger of Ruin dead center, and the Dominion's most powerful warship began to collapse. The universe seemed to hold its breath. For a split second, the Harbinger of Ruin remained intact, a towering monolith of war. The antimatter conduits along its hull flickered, struggling to contain the catastrophic energy unleashed by the Iron Requiem's superweapon. Then, the dreadnought split apart. A shockwave of raw, unrestrained energy tore through its structure, shredding armor. Plating like paper, core breaches erupted in cascading detonations, and the Dominion's prized war machine imploded from within. Fractured hull segments spiraled outward, engulfed in roaring plasma as the Harbinger of Ruin collapsed into itself. The battlefield fell silent. For a moment neither side moved, as if struggling to process what had just happened. The Dominion fleet, so confident, so relentless, now stood leaderless, their most powerful weapon obliterated. On the bridge of the Iron Requiem, Joran Malix exhaled, gripping the railing to steady himself. Every screen flickered with damage. Reports, core instability, radiation leaks, failing life support. But none of it mattered. They had done it. But then, a new warning blared across the ship. Critical core breach. Imminent. Malix's stomach dropped. The superweapon had fired at levels beyond safe containment. The energy feedback was tearing through the ship's systems. The Iron Requiem was dying, and Liora was still inside. Deep within the reactor chamber, Liora struggled to remain conscious. The ship trembled around her, the heat becoming unbearable. Warning displays screamed out emergency shutdown procedures she had just overridden. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The air was thick with smoke, and the metallic taste of burnt circuits coated her tongue. She tried to move, but her limbs were sluggish. The energy overload had drained the ship's reserves, and her own body was failing alongside it. Then the comm crackled to life. "Liora!" Malix's voice cut through the static. "Get out of there! The core's about to—" She forced herself upright. "No." Her voice was hoarse. There's no way to stop it now." Malix cursed under his breath. "We'll come for you. Just hold on." Liora's vision swam. There wasn't time. Even if they launched a rescue team, the Iron Requiem had minutes, maybe seconds, before the core went fully critical. Her gaze shifted to the emergency evacuation system. Damaged. Useless. She clenched her fists. No, not like this. She refused to die here. With the last of her strength, she pushed herself toward the emergency interface. There was only one chance. One final desperate maneuver. If she could transfer the Iron Requiem's remaining power into the reactor's auxiliary conduits, she could create a controlled detonation, enough to propel herself out of the blast radius before the core fully ruptured. A suicide move, unless she timed it perfectly. Her fingers trembled as she entered the sequence. Power diverted, systems rerouted. The Iron Requiem groaned in protest, its circuits sparking under the strain. The countdown to total core failure accelerated. 10 seconds. She sealed herself inside the emergency containment pod. 9. The ship's hull began to splinter, molten debris peeling away as the reactor spiraled toward collapse. 8. Liora secured the restraints. The force of the explosion would either launch her clear of the blast or tear her apart. 7. She exhaled. 6. Her mind drifted to Kalen, Malix, the people she had fought for. 5. To the war that was still far from over. 4. Her fingers hovered over the activation switch. 3. She closed her eyes. 2. She pressed. Tile 1. A blinding explosion engulfed the Iron Requiem. The warship, once the Resistance's last hope, became a supernova of energy, detonating with the force of a collapsing star. The shockwave ripped through the battlefield. Dominion warships, still reeling from the loss of the Harbinger of Ruin, were caught in the expanding blast, their hulls shattered by the sheer power unleashed. Even the Resistance fleet was forced to retreat, their vessels struggling to withstand the violent surge of radiation and debris. But amidst the chaos, a single escape pod hurtled outward, propelled by the force of the explosion. Inside, Liora barely clung to consciousness. The pod's stabilizers fought to keep her on course, but the turbulence was relentless. She could feel the heat of the blast even through the reinforced plating. She was still alive. But for how long? Her systems were failing. Oxygen was running low. The pod was caught in the gravitational pull of a drifting Dominion wreck. She needed help. Her hand weakly activated the distress beacon. This is Liora Tain. Her breath came shallow. I'm still here. Her vision blurred. Darkness crept in at the edges. If no one reached her in time, then everything she had fought for would end here. On the Vindicator, Admiral Kael Varos stood unmoving, his expression dark. His fleet was in ruins. The Harbinger of Ruin was gone. The Resistance had cost him dearly, but the war was not over. Not yet. A transmission flickered on his private console. A Dominion officer, his face streaked with soot and blood, reported in a ragged voice, "Sir, we have her signal." Varos's crimson eyes glowed. "Recover her." A cold smile crept across his face. "Liora Tain belongs to me now." The war in the Andromeda Sector was far from over. Darkness, a thick, suffocating void wrapped around Liora as she drifted between consciousness and oblivion. Cold air burned in her lungs, thin, recycled oxygen struggling to sustain her failing body. Her thoughts came in fragments, slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. Had she survived? The explosion, the escape pod, the distress beacon. Then nothing. A sudden jolt yanked her out of unconsciousness. Her body convulsed as light flooded her vision, blinding and sterile. A mechanical hiss filled the air. The cold embrace of deep space was replaced by something far worse. A Dominion containment cell. Her wrists and ankles were bound to an upright grav restraint, a dull ache radiating from her muscles as the magnetic locks held her in place. The walls were a seamless black, humming faintly with energy, and the air smelled of disinfectant and metal. The Dominion's signature touch, clinical, precise, inescapable. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been captured. Footsteps echoed through the chamber, deliberate and measured. Then, "You're awake," a figure stepped into view. Admiral Kyle Varos. His crimson eyes gleamed like twin dying stars, cold and calculating. He was still clad in battle-worn Dominion armor, the sigils of his rank gleaming under the dim lights. Though the war had scarred him, fresh cuts along his jaw, his left pauldron dented from an earlier strike, he stood with unwavering authority. Liora forced herself to meet his gaze. Her voice was dry, raw. "Should have left me to die." Varos smirked. "Oh, I considered it, but you're far more useful alive." He circled her like a predator assessing wounded prey. "The Iron Requiem is gone. Your fleet is scattered, and you're alone. Tell me, Captain, was it worth it?" Liora's jaw clenched. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a response. Varos exhaled, feigning disappointment. Still defiant. "Good. It means there's still something left to break." He gestured, and the cell's energy field flickered. A projection materialized, a strategic war map of the Andromeda Sector, resistance outposts, Dominion strongholds, planetary defenses. "You see," he continued, his tone almost conversational, "the war doesn't end just because you destroy one ship. Your heroics, impressive as they were, barely slowed us down. The Dominion is already regrouping. New fleets, new commanders, new weapons, and your so-called resistance." He zoomed in. One by one, outposts blinked red, signifying recent losses. "They're dying." Liora kept her face neutral, but a cold weight settled in her chest. "Here's what's going to happen," Varos continued. "You will give me every resistance access code, every hidden supply route. You will tell me where the remnants of your fleet are hiding, and in exchange," he leaned closer, "I'll let you live long enough to see your rebellion burn." Silence stretched between them. Then Liora laughed, a dry, rasping sound but genuine. Varos frowned. "Something amusing?" She lifted her head, eyes burning with defiance. "Yeah, you still don't get it, do you?" Varos said nothing, waiting. Liora's smile was small but unyielding. "You think this war is about ships, bases, fleets? You think killing me, killing all of us, will end it?" Her voice steadied. "This war isn't about strategy. It's about belief. And you can't kill that." Varos studied her for a long moment. Then slowly his smirk returned. "Belief," he chuckled, shaking his head. "Belief doesn't stop warships. It doesn't deflect railgun rounds or disable orbital bombardments." He leaned in, voice cold as the void. "And belief won't save you now." Liora's restraints tightened. The gravlocks hummed with increased pressure, sending white-hot pain through her limbs. She clenched her teeth, refusing to cry out. Varos turned to leave. "You'll talk, Captain. They all do." As the doors slid shut behind him, Liora exhaled. Slowly, her mind racing, she wasn't dead. That meant she still had a chance. And if there was one thing she had learned in this war, the resistance never surrendered. Meanwhile, deep in the outskirts of the Andromeda Sector, a lone ship drifted in the wreckage of the battle. Its hull was battered, its engines struggling to maintain stability. Inside, Joran Malik stood over the communications console, his fingers trembling as he replayed the last signal. Liora's voice. "I'm still here." His fists clenched. They had lost too much, too many good people, too many battles. But this war wasn't over. She was still alive, and he would bring her back, no matter what it took. The battle for Andromeda is far from over. But the question remains, who will win? What happens next? You decide. Should Malix launch a daring rescue? Should Liora escape on her own? Or does the Dominion's grip tighten? Comment your theories below. Join the discussion. Every war has its heroes, and your ideas might shape the next battle. If you love this journey, like the video and share it with fellow sci-fi fans. The war in Andromeda is just beginning.